FSAE, CAE, PMP, CMP, so you know he is dedicated to our industry. And without further delay, I'm going to hand things on over to Tommy. Take it away.
Jody, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone who is here today and watching the recording. Appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what is happening in Washington, D.C. and beyond, and how it's impacting the industry both today and tomorrow. And so that's kind of the agenda today for exhibitions and events in a politics first world. It has been a very busy time in Washington, D.C. over the last several months, and we have certainly had a busy fall here in the nation's capital where I am, although honestly, this is a much more accurate picture of what we've been seeing from Washington, D.C. over the last 5 or 6 weeks or so as the government shutdown continues. We will talk a little bit more about that as we go along today, but the current juxtaposition between what fall is usually like here in DC and what it is today is actually a pretty good analogy for what we've seen from Washington, D.C. this year, because there have been some very beneficial things, some good things for the industry that have come from Capitol Hill and the White House, but there have also been some very challenging things coming from those two areas as well. And as we transition from 2025 into 2026, I think we can expect a little bit more of the same going forward, and we'll get into some of those areas here today as we go through our session. As Jody mentioned, if you have questions as we go along, please type them into the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the conversation today. But first, we want to do a little bit of an overview of how Washington, D.C. is impacting the industry. And we can start by talking about some of the key issues that are impacting the industry. And I like to use a shorthand. I call our priorities the four T's: taxes, talent, tariffs, and travel. And there have been a lot of developments in all four areas this year that I want to share with you all today. We'll take them two at a time. And the first two we'll talk about are the taxes and talent. And these are the areas where there's really been a very good news story coming out of Washington, D.C. over the last year or so. It has been a very U.S. story, it's a very domestic story. And a lot of it all centered around something that happened earlier this year around the issue of tax reform. And for those of you who don't keep up with the latest policy developments from DC, first off, congratulations. You probably live a much better life, and you are glued to your phone a little bit less than I am, which is highly recommended. But what the biggest challenge coming from Capitol Hill this year was anticipated to be was tax reform. And that's because there were some tax breaks that were passed back in 2017. There were tax credits for organizations, corporations, and individuals, and a lot of those were set to expire at the end of 2025. And if Congress didn't act, we were all going to have much heavier paychecks the first time around in 2026. And if you've watched the news with any regularity, you probably do know that Congress oftentimes doesn't act until it absolutely has to. So there was a lot of anticipation here. And in fact, inside the Beltway, we were calling this the Super Bowl of tax. This was an effort that was going to deal with tax breaks of $4.7 trillion over 10 years. And so as we were looking at that, we were looking to make sure that nothing that came about through this tax reform effort in 2025 was going to negatively impact the industry. And so IEE and the other associations that make up ECA formed our tax reform agenda at the beginning of the year, which you can see on the screen right now. And I'll pause here just for a moment to let people take a look at it. But essentially, those first three items kind of almost came from the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, right? First, do no harm. We wanted to make sure that nothing happened tax-wise that was going to negatively impact the industry, negatively impact investment in the industry, or negatively impact any of the stakeholders in the industry, particularly on the organizer side and the nonprofits. We also had a piece in there around workforce development that was a tax provision which dovetailed with ECA's workforce agenda for 2025, which is really about trying to get the government involved in helping the industry attract and train its next generation workforce, which is just such an important aspect to the future of the industry. We were looking to see if we could get Congress involved in supporting efforts to help us make sure that our workforce was well trained and certified going forward. And all of this was percolating behind the scenes in 2024, but really became public in early 2025 and came to a head on July 4th, actually, with a piece of legislation that was called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Before you ask, no, I do not know how they named these bills and why they continue to give them silly names here in DC, but this is kind of a tradition that, all the legislation has to have a name that's an acronym or something memorable. So this was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And it was Congress's tax reform as signed into law by President Trump that addressed the tax cliff in terms of individual tax cuts, which were ultimately extended, but also addressed quite a few of the issues that ECA was interested in. And when all was said and done, when the One Big Beautiful Bill was signed into law, if you look at the four pillars of ECA's tax reform agenda, we actually went four for four as an industry. There were no harmful tax increases, no change to the tax status of association events or anything like that. And we were successful at helping 529 college savings plans expand really into becoming career savings plans by allowing those funds and those plans to pay for certifications like IEEE CEM program. Those can now be paid for out of 529 programs as well, which is a big win for the industry. And actually, we didn't go four for four. We actually went five for four because we were able to get the Pell Grant expansion that we were interested in to help the Pell Grants pay for skilled workforce training. We were able to get that into this law, and it was actually paired with a $10.5 billion increase in funding for the Pell Grant program. So these were all very good news for the industry. I'll drop a link into the chat that kind of has a little bit more about ECA's perspective on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and what was contained in it. And so very, very good news for the industry. And it was something that timing wise was very unique because this came on the heels of our annual Legislative Action Day, which takes place at the end of each May in Washington, D.C. Some of you may come to town for Sam Lippman's ECEF event. We actually do Legislative Action Day in partnership with him and do it the day after. It was once upon a time called Exhibitions Day, but it really does bring nearly 200 people from the industry. I think we had folks from 30 states this year who were on Capitol Hill, and you'll look at this slide, you'll see some faces from the IAE universe who should look very familiar. And they were carrying the message of the importance of workforce development and avoiding harmful tax policies for Legislative Action Day this year. So, very happy to report that their efforts definitely paid off. And this is part of sort of a more broad domestic policy story this year. We had some victories on the sustainability front in California, where we were able to stave off some potentially harmful policies that weren't necessarily aligned with where IE members and folks who, use the EIC principles for sustainability and who've signed the Net Zero Carbon Events Pledge, we were able to stave off and get delayed some potentially harmful policies there. And, not necessarily impacting the industry, but, certainly impacting many of your customers. We have a bit of a broader deregulatory environment in Washington, D.C., and will for the next few years. And so, taken together, it's a very good news story. That is something that, ECA believes that is going to underpin the growth of the industry for quite some time to come. So, on the taxes and talent, we've had a lot of good news. But when you look at the other two T's in ECA's agenda, the tariffs and the travel, we've had a little bit of a different story. We have definitely seen challenges coming from Washington, D.C., that no doubt you all have experienced on the ground and on the show floor over the last several months. And it is one that is very, very internationally focused. And I think any conversation, any story around what we see when it comes to the international environment has to start with the issue of tariffs. But you'll have to excuse me for just a moment because any conversation about tariffs needs to take a little bit of a side journey through the 1986 cinematic classic, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And what does Ferris Bueller's Day Off have to do with taxes? Well, if you remember this legendary scene where Ben Stein is at the front of the classroom talking in economics class, looking for Ferris, who is absent that day. Ben Stein is actually teaching about something called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930. And what do the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 have to do with today's conversation? Well, if you remember this scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, or maybe some of the archaic details from your history and economics classes from days gone by, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 were Congress's way of responding to the stock market crash of 1929 and trying to stave off economic malaise. But what it really did was send America straight into the Great Depression of the 1930s. High tariff rates trying to protect the American market wound up creating a situation where um, costs across the board were raised in the United States. People lost millions of jobs, millions of homes were ultimately vacated and foreclosed on, and it led to the Great Depression. And why it matters today in the conversation that we're having right now is because of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Congress did something that it very, very rarely ever does, was they admitted they were wrong. And they admitted that their tariff policy was so destructive that starting in 1933 and going all the way through the 1970s, Congress basically got out of the business of doing tariffs. They delegated all of that to the executive branch and the president, the United States Trade Representative's office. And so, if you've at any point in time looked over the last, I don't know, 8 months or so at some of the tariff news coming out of Washington, D.C., and asked yourself, well, why doesn't somebody do something about this? Well, the answer is there's nobody to do anything about it. All of this policy rests with the president. And that's why, as we sit here today, as you can see on this chart, you're looking at one of the highest tariff rates since the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1933 that took us into the Great Depression. Depending on where goods are coming into America right now, you have a baseline tariff of between 10 and 50% on those goods, which are increasing costs for everyday Americans, but certainly also for our industry. And you think about all the inputs for things like, metal for rigging and wood for booths. This is significantly impacted by what we see here. And if you look at some of the numbers up on the screen, it's really quite staggering what we've seen over the last year or so. You have nearly $1 trillion in goods coming into the United States that have new tariffs on them that have been introduced over the last several months. Emergency tariffs, about $800 billion of those goods. Those are the things that you might have seen in the news. The reciprocal tariffs on countries around the world importing goods to America. The baseline tariffs, tariffs on the United States, or I'm sorry, on Canada, Mexico, and China for failing to control the flow of fentanyl into the United States. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those emergency tariffs here in just a moment. A little less than half of the tariffs have been placed on goods coming in from China, about 10% or so coming from Canada and Mexico. But the numbers at the bottom, I think, tell the story. It's been a little bit of a drag on GDP. It's been a little bit of a kicker on inflation. And that number down at the bottom, I got to tell you, just as somebody who does this, in Washington, D.C. for a living, those numbers at the bottom terrify me. Because in the last year or so, we took in nearly double the tariff revenue that we did the year before. And for fiscal year 2026, which actually for the federal government starts on October 1st, or at least it's supposed to start when the government's open, and goes through September 30th of next year, the US is estimated to take in nearly a third of $1 trillion in tariff revenue. Why is that worrying? Well, that's a lot of money out of the pockets of Americans who are paying for importing goods into the United States, and that shows up, to our customers and to people, every day at stores and the like. But that money that comes in, that $323 billion that's estimated for next year, that just goes right into the general treasury, and Congress and the president can spend it. And they will. Trust me, they will spend it. And once Congress starts spending a pot of money, it gets really hard to take that pot of money away. So I really worry about the long-term impacts here that we're seeing, and something that's actually happening right now as we're speaking is going to help determine that, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, other trade news, there's been a little game of deal or no deal that's been going on in the U.S. with their trading partners. There are new trade deals that have been struck with the EU, the UK, Japan, South Korea, and some of our other trading partners. But we don't have new trade deals with Canada, Mexico, India, and some of our other large trading partners. And the situation with China is very much in flux. Last week, the president and President Xi of China struck a trade arrangement, but only covering some of the issues of contention between the two countries. So, lots of things that have been happening on the tariff front, and almost all of those have been coming directly from the White House. But actually, as we speak right now, the venue of most interest for the industry has actually moved from the White House to the Supreme Court. And right now, as we speak, we're about 2 hours into hearings into two cases, one called Learning Resources versus Trump, one called VOS Selections versus Trump, that are going to decide whether those emergency tariffs we were talking about just a moment ago, the baseline, the reciprocal, the fentanyl tariffs, that about $800 billion worth of goods into the US have had those tariffs applied to them, whether they're constitutional or not. And this is a big case. It was brought by two toy companies who sued the Trump administration, arguing that the legislation that the tariffs were issued under, something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not allow the president to actually apply those tariffs. And so that is being heard by the Supreme Court right now. And when there's a ruling, most likely in early to mid-January, it's going to create some clarity, hopefully, for the industry when it comes to those tariffs. If you want to read more about this, I'll put the link to an article in TSNN that I wrote earlier this week, sort of laying out some of the legal arguments and some of what's being argued right now. But what is at stake here is those particular tariffs, if they are ruled unconstitutional, they are immediately rescinded. About $150 billion in tariff revenue might be refunded to stakeholders, both within the industry and more broadly, for those tariffs. But it sort of creates a bit of a fork in the road for tariff policy. And I think the question that I get asked most when it comes to this is, well, what happens then? Do all the tariffs go away? And while the emergency tariffs go away, I have to sadly report that that does not necessarily mean the end of tariffs. I'm going to put a quote up on the screen right now that Donald Trump made at a political event in New Hampshire, where he was arguing that rather than increasing taxes on US citizens, we should use tariffs to pay down the deficit and the debt. And he made this in October of 1987. So this is an issue that President Trump has been very passionate about for quite some time. And just because the emergency tariffs are repealed by the Supreme Court doesn't mean the end of tariffs. There are actually a wide range of other laws in effect that allow the president to levy tariffs on imported goods from other countries. So tariffs are going to be with us through at least the end of 2028, if not significantly longer, which sort of begs the question of, well, then why does the Supreme Court case actually matter? And the answer comes down to time. If you look at these pieces on the screen, these different laws from the previous slide, there's a reason the president didn't want to use them and wanted to use so-called emergency powers instead, which is all of these take a really long time to introduce. That first bullet point at the top inside DC, we call it Section 232 tariffs. They are applied generally to certain categories of goods coming in from countries around the world. A Section 232 investigation can last up to 270 days, so 9 months. Once the investigation is complete, the president has up to 90 days to introduce tariffs if they're so warranted. And so that takes about a year. A Section 301, which is the second bullet point down, tends to take a little longer. And so the one thing that the industry hasn't had since the start of these new trade wars back in January is any time to prepare for them. The president has used emergency powers to implement most of these tariffs. And so what that has created is a situation where you have one tariff rate one day and a different tariff rate the next day. If the Supreme Court rules these tariffs are unconstitutional, You've got a long time for these Section 232 and 301 investigations and these other types of tariffs to be implemented, which gives the industry planning time for the first time in a while when it comes to trade policy. And you've got a period of time that when the tariffs are rescinded to when new tariffs can be introduced, you take that number, I think it was 15.6% earlier of the current effective tariff rate, and that drops to about 6%. So there's significant cost savings. But then you can begin to plan for other tariffs that might be introduced. We have an opportunity as ECA to weigh in on them from an advocacy and lobbying perspective. And we've got much more control over what we can do about them. We can forward purchase certain things. We can write things into contracts that provide our organizations protection from new tariffs. So it gives the industry time for the first time in a long time to be able to go on the offense when it comes to tariffs. In the meantime, I would encourage everybody to check out ECA's Tariff Resource Center. We put new tariff news up there almost weekly at this point that has the latest news that, you all and your organizations can do right now. And so we can see what we have for the latest updates. We'll continue to update this regularly. So highly encourage everyone to take a look at that, bookmark it, come back to it from time to time, because this is going to be an ever-evolving issue for the industry, regardless of what the Supreme Court decides. So the other issue we have at play here from the four T's is, of course, travel. And there are lots of international travel issues that have been in the headlines that impact the industry. And maybe we'll start with visas because that has been one that has been a challenge for the industry for years now. But to talk about visas, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about the difference of how we as the industry view visas versus how Capitol Hill and the White House views visas. And it just comes down to a lens of perspective. And when we think about visas, it's pretty simple. It's a business issue for us, right? We're trying to bring international exhibitors and attendees and buyers to our events so that they can exhibit, participate, share knowledge, network, do business, all the great things that the events that you're part of every day do. But DC sees it differently. DC sees visas inherently as an immigration issue. And that creates a very significant challenge when it comes to visa policy that can benefit the industry. Now, there have been good things that have happened when it comes to visas recently. Last year, ECA successfully lobbied for $50 million for the State Department to work through some of the visa backlogs that have been plaguing the industry since the end of the pandemic. I think, what was it, November of 2021, so 4 years ago, when international travel was reintroduced. We had wait times in some countries of up to 3 years for a visa interview, which was keeping some of our international customers on the sidelines and was forcing some organizers to, franchise their events and introduce international versions because they couldn't bring that part of their community to the US. That has gotten decidedly better. As we would be sitting here this time last year, there were 92 embassies and consulates that the US has around the world where it took longer than 3 months to get a visa interview, which is ECA's gold standard. We think if you put a visa application in, you should be interviewed within 90 days. That number's now down to 47. Now that's good news, but I still think there are 47 too many embassies that have long wait times, and those are harming the industry in places like Mexico, India, Latin America, the Middle East, where we're still seeing some pretty significant wait times. Now, what happens with those wait times going forward is going to be very, very interesting to see because we had some pandemic era visa interview waivers that went away. None that impacted our industry, the folks who travel in on B1 business visas, but other types of visas where, now if you had a visa that had been expired for 3 years and you didn't have a criminal record, you could reapply for your visa and not have to have an interview. Well, that's down to 12 months now for things like academics, seasonal workers coming to the US. And why that matters to us is all of those people go into the same visa queue. So when you go and apply for a visa from somewhere abroad and you say it's going to take 60 days to get an interview, well, that's people who are applying for business visas, people who are looking to bring their families to the US to go to Disney World, academics looking to come here to have a professor position at a university. They all go in the same queue. And so there's a potential that this may lengthen wait times going forward. Now, this also was introduced at the same time that Congress passed what they're calling a visa integrity fee, what I kind of call a travel deterrence fee, that would increase the prices of visas by $250 each which went into effect on October 1st statutorily. That brings the cost of applying for a visa to come to the US to somewhere between $430 and $480, which is, one of the most expensive visas in the world. Now, I say it went into law on October 1st. It is actually not in effect as of October 1st for a couple different reasons. One is with the shutdown, they couldn't introduce the new fee. But also, Congress sometimes when they write these laws, they don't do a very good job. And this was one of those times. The law that introduced this fee instructed the Department of Homeland Security to collect this $250 visa fee and then use it for a wide variety of different measures that would keep people from overstaying their visas. That's problematic because the Department of Homeland Security doesn't issue visas, the Department of State does. And so the Department of State couldn't collect this fee on Homeland Security's benefit. So the Homeland Security Department is currently building a brand new system to collect this fee that collects the fee alongside the other fees the Department of State collects. And if you know anything about government technology projects, those take a really long time to implement. So as of right now, while the fee is in effect in law, it is actually not being collected. And I can't imagine it's going to be collected until early 2026 at the soonest. Now, ECA and other groups are working behind the scenes to see what we can do to limit this visa's impact. Because if you look at these numbers from the U.S. Travel Association, you see that this fee, it's estimated to cost the United States a pretty significant amount of travelers and spending for international folks coming to the U.S. Just for perspective, for that 990,000 number, there were 72 million folks who came to the US last year for either business or vacation. That's about 1.5% of travelers would be deterred from coming to the US and applying for a visa based on this new fee, which has a significant impact. Now, this has also been introduced at the same time that the State Department is running what they call a visa bond program, a pilot program that's running for a year, where folks from 6 African countries, including Gambia, Malawi, Mauritania, Sao Tome and Principe, Tanzania, and Zambia, now have to pay between $5,000 and $15,000 bond to be able to receive a short-term visa. These are all countries that had visa overstay rates of more than, I believe it's 40%. So that meant 4 out of every 10 visas were issued. Folks did not return to their country and stayed in the United States longer than that. So this is being introduced as a way to potentially deter that. 6 countries sounds like a lot, but it's actually only going to affect about 2,000 visas this year. But at the same time, we also have new country-specific travel bans that were introduced back in June. As you look at the map here, you see 19 countries where inbound travel to the United States is either fully or partially restricted. So folks from these countries can't travel. For the partially restricted ones in orange on the screen, those countries actually most business travel still continues. But if you look at the countries on the screen, you're looking at about another 350,000 people who came to the US last year. So a little less than 0.5%. Right after that was introduced, there were a group of 36 countries that received a warning from the US State Department saying that they needed to tighten up some of their passport issuing processes. Particularly, these are countries where, under certain circumstances, folks from another country can come, move to these countries, invest a particular amount of money in those countries, and then be made citizens. So they could then receive a passport from one of these countries. This has gained particular interest in the media in light of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, where lots of countries have restricted travel from Russian nationals into the country. This is a way for citizens of means from Russia to skirt those travel restrictions, come to one of these countries, make some investments, get a passport, and again, have unfettered international travel. Now, when this memo was issued, it was said that punishment could be up to and including being included among the 19 countries that travel is already fully or partially restricted from. Now, if you look at all these countries together, you're looking at about 450,000 visits last year to the United States, so just above 0.5%. And you start to add these numbers up. You get 1.5% on the visa fee, 1% with these potentially restricted countries, and you're starting to get a drip, drip, drip of bad news from a travel perspective that is resonating internationally, particularly when combined with some of the headlines that we saw around people being denied access to the United States earlier this year by Homeland Security at the border, and some things like, hearing news stories that, we might not have enough air traffic controllers working to be able to land your airplane. And we're getting this situation that's beginning to show up in the data where there's this misperception that the US is closed for business. And like I said, the data is beginning to show this. What you see on this slide from tourism economics is, as of a couple of months ago, inbound arrivals to the US from abroad were expected to fall about 8% this year, which is a significant decrease. As you can see in that dark line, there was originally an increase projected this year. But now you've got a decrease both in 2025 and a slow trajectory for international travel growth going forward. If you follow that lighter blue line all the way up to that dotted line, the story that that tells is in 2029, we will have the same number of international travelers into the United States that we had back in 2019. So a whole decade of growth in international travel has gone by the wayside due to the pandemic and some of these measures which we just talked about. Overall, international travel spending into the US is going to be down about 3% this year. Now, you say 3%, okay, that's less than 8%. That's good news. Basically, the other 5% that you're looking at here is inflation and price increases. So, not really a good news story on the travel front, if coming from some places. And I think ground zero from that, as we've all seen in the news, has been from Canada. On the screen right now, you'll see the year-over-year decline of Canadian tourists coming to the US by car. For August of 2025, the last month we have full data for, more than a third fewer trips were taken by Canadian citizens coming to the United States crossing the border by car. When you look at by plane, that number's down by more than a quarter. So the ongoing resentment with regard to some of the trade conversations between the United States and Canada definitely is showing up in the data. And I've certainly heard anecdotally from show organizers and others that they are seeing considerably smaller Canadian contingents into their events this year. Now, it's not all bad news from the travel front. For example, inbound travel from Mexico is up nearly 12% this year. Not enough to make up for the decreases in travel from Canada, but we're seeing sizable growth from the Mexican market. And if you look at the top 20 markets into the US, as you see on this chart right here, you see that it's flat overall. It's about down about 0.5%, going through August of this year. So that's the last month that full data is published for. And you see that there are countries like the UK, Japan, Brazil, Spain, Italy, and others where travel into the US is actually up this year. But that's being offset by decreased travel from Western Europe, Germany, France. You see South Korea, China, India. So it's a bit of a mixed story there. Now, if I can leave this part on at least one little piece of good news, it would be that overall, the business traveler is holding up much better than the leisure traveler in terms of coming to America. What you see on the screen in those two circles is you have the number of folks who've entered the US on a business visa versus the number of folks who've entered on a tourist visa this year. And business visa numbers are up, tourism visa numbers are down. So you got about a 4% swing there. So when you see things on the news talking about decreased travel to the US, just know that in general, up to this point, the business traveler, folks who would be coming for our events, are holding up better than the leisure traveler. Now, what does that look like in the long term? I think that very much remains to be seen, both in terms of those numbers, but also just what does this downturn in travel and these travel policies and tariff policies, how do they impact the competitiveness of the industry in the US? How do they impact the competitiveness of the US as a destination for international events? I think at this point, that is pretty unclear. And that's something we're going to be keeping a very sharp eye on in the weeks and months ahead. But regardless, I think it's fair to say that from an international perspective, we are definitely seeing some headwinds in the industry. And I expect those headwinds to persist at least into the early parts of next year. So you've seen on the four T's what we have here, which all sort of begs the big picture question, so what? What does it matter? How does it impact the industry? And what should we be keeping an eye on? And I will do my best to come up with some predictions on some of those for the moment. We'll start with the government shutdown. Today marks a bit of a dubious day. It is day 36 of the shutdown, which means this shutdown is the longest government shutdown in US history, which is not good news. The good news, however, is that we are very close to a resolution here. As we sit here on November 5th, I anticipate that no later than the end of next week, we should have a continuing resolution, and government will be fully reopened. We just joined as ECA a letter that U.S. Travel Association and about 500 other groups were on, calling on congressional leaders to figure this out as soon as possible, but certainly before the Thanksgiving travel crush that's coming. As you've all seen in the news and maybe experienced firsthand, the air traffic control system in particular is about reached its breaking point. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy said that if the government shutdown persists into next week, the US may have to close down certain parts of airspace because we don't have enough air traffic controllers to provide the level of safety and redundancy we need for full air traffic during a given day. If you shut air traffic control down in one particular location in the United States, you're going to impact the entire country. So you're looking at mass delays, mass cancellations, and bad news. So hopefully this one will be taken care of very soon. On the tariff front, as we talked about earlier, the Supreme Court case that's being argued right now is going to determine the trajectory of the tariffs going forward. We just recommend everybody continue to be planning for tariffs going forward into 2028 and beyond in some way, shape, or form. Hopefully, ones that give the industry more time to plan and give the industry time to write contracts that are going to protect your organizations from future tariff increases. I've talked to folks, for example, in the booth building community right now who signed contracts 9, 12 months ago that every one of their builds they're doing right now is at a loss because tariffs weren't forecast on imports like softwood from Canada. So just encourage everybody from a planning and protection standpoint, please keep tariffs top of mind. From an international travel perspective, we have been reminding folks on the ACA side for a long time and just continue to do so. Please tell your customers, tell your stakeholders that if they're looking to come to the US for events, please, if they need a visa, apply early, early, early. I have seen some organizers who are sending out messages to their international attendees as soon as one event ends, 365 days before next year's event, telling them, hey, make sure you don't forget about your visa. I've seen folks put reminders to their international customers, their exhibitors, on their retention packs as they're selling on the show floor, putting this in like big red paper front and center. Hey, we want you back here next year, but we want to make sure that you're able to get into the country. So early is important, as is flexibility. I've seen a lot of organizers offer more flexible terms to international exhibitors and attendees for whom visa issues and other issues may prevent them from attending. Different refund policies, for example, being able to roll money over into the next year, that type of thing, that is giving international customers a little bit more certainty around being able to put money down in advance of events happening next year. From a communication standpoint, this is one I keep hearing from folks all the time. Communication has to do two things right now for your international community. You have to continually reinforce the value of your event, but also make sure that you're reinforcing how welcome your international customers, buyers, attendees are at your events. I have been overseas several times since a lot of these tariffs were introduced and a lot of these travel policies were introduced. And, some of the raw feelings are real. There are some people who really do feel that the US has hung out that closed for business sign. And in your communications and in your relationships with your customer base, showing them that you might be seeing or hearing one thing, but we feel very differently and we want you at our event is a very, very important message to continue to deliver to your international communities. So, in summary, we've got the four T's, the big issues that are driving things within the industry: taxes, talent, tariffs, and travel. On the taxes and talents side, it's been a good news story. It's been one that we think is going to do significant benefit to the industry in the years ahead. But when you look at those tariffs and travel, you're looking at a situation where you're dealing with some pretty significant headwinds, and these are things that you need to keep on the agenda within your organization going into 2026 because you're not going to be able to predict what happens in the future, But I do anticipate that whether it's 2026 or beyond, whether we like it or not, and you can put me squarely in the or not camp, we are going to be in a situation of uncertainty, and we're going to be in a situation where I believe that politics is going to continue to be the biggest external driver of the industry into next year and beyond. And that is why ECA is incredibly grateful to be able to partner with IAE. IAE was one of our founding members and maintains leadership roles. We've got Mark Bogdansky from the Auto Care Association and Mike Carlucci from Clarion Events, who are representing IEEE on the ECA board of directors. And we're very happy to have both IEEE's involvement, but also the opportunity to be able to just provide you this update today. And so with that, Jody, I'm going to pause here and turn to you, see if we have any questions or any comments or feedback from your perspective.
Yeah, that was a ton of information. So, for folks that are attending live, please go ahead and add your questions into the chat. We'll make sure we get all of those answered. In the meantime, I've got a couple questions of my own. So, since we see so much happening, so much uncertainty when it comes to shows we might already have scheduled, potential travel delays, things like that, would it be a best practice from a event organizer standpoint to proactively put information out to participants so that they are aware and everybody's on the same page? Or what's your recommendations there? Just kind of, I know there's a lot in the news, but what can we do to be proactive to help make sure that our international and our domestic participants aren't going to have issues and can plan ahead?
You know, for folks whose events have gone off in the last 2 or 3 months, so kind of late Q3, early Q4, the feedback that I've gotten from organizers who were running at that point was it was their perspective that you can't communicate about this enough. That just continued drumbeats, whether it's in your know before you go messages, whether it's any proactive outreach that you're doing separately to your international customers or attendees, that really putting this on the radar screen, you can't do it early enough and you can't do it often enough. Because, all these messages, folks are receiving tons of messages every day. And sometimes what's the old adage in marketing, right? You've got to say it 7 times before somebody internalizes it. That's really something to keep in mind because this is something that, particularly on the travel side, if there's a visa involved, if there are changing policies, if there are increased costs, they're going to want to know as early as possible so that they can make their contingency plans, so that they can set aside the money, whatever the case may be. So, Jody, I think absolutely you can't talk about this enough and you can't talk about it early enough at this point.
The other thing that, from an event organizer standpoint, is it a best practice to check in with your event venue, hotels, check to see and make sure. It could be that we're seeing a lag in registrations potentially. Obviously, most event organizers already, if they've got events right now, they've already been planned, they're in the works. Is there anything from a contractual standpoint that event organizers and hotels and venues should be aware of when it comes to folks canceling, not being able to make it in because of shutdown implications?
That's a fantastic question. And, particularly on the hotel side, if you've seen one hotel contract, you've seen one hotel contract, and there's so much difference and variation. I have heard some anecdotes that for events with large international footprints, that some of the hotel partners are looking at attrition clauses a little differently and providing a little flexibility and grace. I will say I have not heard that across the board enough to say that that is something blanket that's happening. I would just encourage folks going forward as they're signing contracts, whatever contingency clauses you can put into them, whether it's on hotels, whether it's on supplies, whether it's on customers, whatever the case may be, I would just have your legal teams think about from an international travel perspective and from a tariff perspective, what can you be doing to provide your organization with downside protection right now? Because, for example, if the Supreme Court chooses to uphold the emergency tariffs, we are going to be in an environment for the next 3 years where tariffs can change day by day. And people have to be prepared for that. We don't want a situation like those booth builders I was talking about earlier that are doing every one of their builds right now at a loss because they didn't factor tariffs into their cost equation. So I would just think about all the places that, whether you're an organizer or whether you're a supplier, where's the potential points of weakness for you? Where within your operations or within your scope of control, some of the policies we talked about earlier, where could they impact you? Where could they take a profitable event and turn it into an unprofitable event? And then go look at your contracts, look at the contracts you're signing, but also looking at the contracts you're presenting to your customers, your attendees, your exhibitors, your buyers, and think about what you can do to protect your organization. Because regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court, tariffs are going to be with us for at least another 3 years. Some of these travel policies are going to be with us. So this is something we have to keep our eye on the ball on as an industry.
Excellent. The other thing that I was kind of thinking about from a event organizer standpoint is a lot of conferences and events typically try to do some sort of community service project. And obviously right now we've got a massive situation with SNAP benefits and things like that being delayed or canceled during this shutdown. Is that something that groups should start to look at if they don't already start having some of those community oriented community service projects to actually start to add into their conferences and event planning to be able to give back to the local community and be able to support the public? Or is the best practice to just kind of focus in on our event and really be more focused there?
I mean, I think if you're looking to demonstrate the reach and the power and the impact of your community that you bring together around these events, I think that's an absolute wonderful idea. And this is a point where I would encourage you all to leverage those partnerships with your destination partners in your communities who know what the needs are, who know where the impact is. And I would say this is particularly salient for those of you who run events in Q4 and in Q1. The challenge that has been with us in DC for now for more than 30 years is the government is supposed to have its funding taken care of every year by September 30th. The government fiscal year begins on October 1st, and the government is supposed to have all 12 of its funding bills done, signed by the president, just schoolhouse rock style, by September 30th. The last time that has happened is 1994. And it is a failure on Capitol Hill. It is a political failure, but it has become a reality and it has become an annual reality. And if you think about whether it's the types of projects you're talking about, or whether you have an event that brings a large cohort of government folks in either as attendees or speakers or exhibitors, this is just going to be an ongoing risk in your event portfolio because and this is something that I'm hesitant to bring up right now, but with the prospect of the government shutdown ending next week, that doesn't mean the government's funded until the end of the fiscal year. That just means they're going to keep talking. And so there is a non-0% chance there could be a second government shutdown before Congress finishes its appropriations responsibilities for the year. And there's nothing to say there couldn't be another one next year or the year after. I'm not terribly sure, candidly, what this government shutdown has done. I don't know that anybody's won or proven a point politically, but this is just one more political tool at politicians' disposal. So if you have any sort of government involvement with your conference, particularly in Q4, Q1, I would just continue to monitor this as sharply as you can because this is just a risk going forward.
From an advocacy standpoint, I know you mentioned May and really getting out to Capitol Hill. Is there anything from an industry standpoint that our members and the community as a whole from the events industry, is there anything that we can do in the meantime to help advocate for change and really help create that opportunity prior to May?
There are a whole lot of different opportunities. If you'll give me just a moment, I'll kind of read through a couple of them. One, before I get to the advocacy opportunities, I want to point out here, if you scan this QR code or click the link that I just put into the chat, ECA puts out a newsletter every other Friday. Our next issue goes out tomorrow. where we really quick hitting, takes 2 or 3 minutes to read. We try not to overwhelm people with information, but keep our finger on the pulse of these issues and try to let everybody in the community know what's happening on Capitol Hill, what's happening in the White House, and why that matters and how that's going to impact your events. So would definitely encourage you to sign up for this. Like I said, it's once every other week. We don't spam you for anything else. We just want to make sure we're getting the word out as best we can. From an advocacy perspective, we have something we call the ECA Advocacy Network. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. You see the QR code on the screen. And we have a whole range of programs that people can take part in from wherever they are, whether you're, if you're in the office, if you're at home, if you're on your phone, if you're on the show floor, we've got things you can do. We've got a way you can email your member of Congress to make your voice heard on some of these issues that we talked about today and talk about how it impacts your organization and your event. We've got a social influencer program where we'll provide you content to share on social media and tag your members of Congress or your mayor or your governor because so much of the political conversation, for better or for worse, does take place online these days. We've got an op-ed program where if you want to write a letter to the editor and an op-ed to your local media outlet or newspaper, we'll help you do that. And we've got something that I think is really cool called the Show Floor program, where we will show you how you can bring policymakers out to your events to walk the show floor, come to move in, and help them better understand what you do and how it impacts the communities that these events take place in. Because one of the challenges on Capitol Hill is we're an incredibly experiential industry. You got to see it, you got to experience, you got to feel it. And it's tough to do when you're in a congressional office. But by bringing people down to the show floor, they're able to experience it firsthand. They're able to see it and see all of their constituents, all of the labor folks, the booth builders, the contractors, the caterers, everybody who makes this incredible ecosystem go. They see all that work happening and they kind of make the connection and go, ah, so that's why this matters to my community. It's not just how many bed nights there are in hotels, it's not just the tax revenue, but there's something really special that this industry contributes to the communities, and the show floor program is a way to do that. And of course, I would also be remiss if I did not mention that, we do have our Legislative Action Day every year. It is going to be taking place at the end of May 2026. I believe it's May 28th. It's the Thursday after Memorial Day. Like I said, last year we had nearly 200 folks from 30 states come and meet. I think they did more than 150 meetings with members of Congress. And as you saw with the tax reform and the workforce priorities, that advocacy really made a difference. It really helped push things over the line. So for those of you who haven't been before, I can tell you if you click that link, there's a video that our friends at CNTV did. You can kind of get a sense of the look and feel of it. It is really a remarkable day. You see so many industry leaders and advocates sharing their stories and sharing their perspectives with policymakers because, we don't connect with data points, we connect with stories. And you all have the stories of what happens on the floor, what happens within your organizations, and how it impacts your city, your state, the country at large, and you can tell that way better than anybody else. So we encourage you, if you've never been before, we've got some first-timer programs. We make sure it feels easy and natural to you, and we just encourage everybody to kind of check that out as well.
Excellent. So I'm going to add into the chat for those folks that are attending the live session, the link over to the participant materials for those folks attending on demand. It will be in the handouts tab over on the session landing page. And that is also where you all will be able to find the session evaluation. We read the evaluations. We'll send the evaluation feedback over to Tommy as well.